Good evening, rather good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you. Special time, noon Pacific on a Tuesday. Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Shendor in the Bronx, Karen in Northern California, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, Alyssa in Philadelphia, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. We are continuing our journey through Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. Our daf today is Lamed Zayin, page 37, although we're actually beginning on 36a, the bottom of 36a, with Mishnah number 9. But with God's help, we'll complete Mishnah number 9 and get into Mishnah number 10 today here in chapter 1. These are generally speaking the laws of betrothal. But in chapter 1, we got into, kind of pretty extended digression on the laws of acquisition. Then we sort of returned back to betrothal in terms of the obligation of a father to find a wife for his son. And then based on that, we drew distinctions between the obligations of a mother and of a father, and more generally, the obligations of a man versus a woman. And we talked the last few days about women not obligated in time-bound positive commandments. With some exceptions, and women obligated in positive commandments that are not time-bound, with some exceptions, and women obligated just like men in all negative prohibitions, all negative commandments, also known as prohibition, with the exception of that you shall not destroy your beard or the corners of your scalp, or becoming impure for the dead. The first two are just obligations on men, not on women, and the last being an obligation on male priests, and there are no female priests, and so therefore it does not apply to them. But we derived how we know that it is so. And with that, we concluded Mishnah number 8 of chapter 1. And now we open Mishnah number 9, and continuing some of these distinctions in the law between men and women. Mishnah number 9 of chapter 1. With regard to the placing of hands, semicha, on the head of an offering. So when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, which tragically it hasn't in almost 2,000 years, and we bring offerings to the priests at the temple to bring up on our behalf. So if you're bringing a goat or a sheep, for example, or an ox, and you're going to put your hands on the head of the animal, that's called placing hands. And then there's the waving of certain offerings, which will be discussed how that is done. And the bringing near of meal offerings to the corner of the altar, and the removal of a handful from meal offerings, right? That's when you bring a grain offering. Meal offering refers to grain, flour, sifted flour. And the burning of sacrificial parts of certain offerings on the altar, as opposed to burnt offerings, which are entirely consumed, sin offerings. Some of it goes up on the altar, some of it is given to the priests, for example. And the pinching, malika, of bird offerings, because they are slaughtered in a certain way. And the collecting of blood of offerings in a vessel, and the sprinkling of blood. All these practices, all these parts of the ritual of bringing offerings apply to men and not to women. all these mitzvahs apply specifically to men and not to women, except for the meal offering of a sota, the suspected adulteress, and the meal offering of a female nazir, a Nazirite woman, which these women do waive. And now we go into the Gemara on Mishnah number 9. From where is it derived that placing of the hands on the head of an offering applies only to men? As it is written, speak to the sons of Israel, and he shall place his hand, which you'll find in Leviticus chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, which indicates that the sons of Israel place hands on offerings, but the daughters of Israel do not place hands. And the Gemara explains that the halacha, the law of waving, is derived from the following verse. Speak to the sons of Israel, etc., and he shall wave. Leviticus 7, 29 and 30, which likewise teaches that the sons of Israel wave the offerings, but the daughters of Israel do not wave, just like placing their hands. With regard to bringing near, this is as it is written, and this is the law of the meal offering. The sons of Aaron shall bring it near, and this teaches that the sons of Aaron bring the meal offering near, but not the daughters of Aaron. With regard to the removal of a handful, this is as it is written, and he shall bring it to the sons of Aaron, the priests, and he shall remove a handful. This teaches that the sons of Aaron take a handful, but the daughters of Aaron do not. With regard to the removal, did I just say that? Yeah. With regard to the burning of sacrificial parts, this is as it is written, and the sons of Aaron shall burn it. Leviticus 3:5. And this teaches that it is the sons of Aaron who burn the sacrificial parts, but not the daughters of Aaron. And with regard to pinching and bird offerings, this is as it is written, and he shall pinch and he shall burn. And this verse juxtaposes killing to burning, and just as the burning of an offering must be performed by the male priest, so too pinching may be performed only by men. With regard to receiving the blood, this is as it is written, and the sons of Aaron shall present the blood. Leviticus 1:5. And the master, meaning the sage, said in the explanation of this verse, and the sons of Aaron shall present, this is the collecting of the blood. Now we're on page 36b. The Gemara discusses the Mishnah's ruling that women do not perform sprinkling. To which sprinkling is this referring? If this is sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer, right, this was used in the purification of people who came into contact with a corpse, either because you walked through a cemetery and walked over a corpse, or because you helped in the matter of the burial and you carried the corpse, etc. You actually touched a dead body. So before you can enter the grounds of the holy temple, the Temple Mount, you must be purified of your tumas mace, your corpse tuma, and that requires the sprinkling of the water containing the ashes of the red heifer before, and a 7-day purification, which includes the sprinkling on the 3rd and 7th days, and then on the 7th day the immersion in the mikvah, and then awaiting nightfall, and then you can enter the temple. We haven't had a red heifer in nearly 2,000 years, and that's why we're all in a state of tuma, ritual impurity. So, sprinkling. The Mishnah is ruling that women do not perform sprinkling. To which sprinkling is this referring? If this is the sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer, Eliezer is written with regard to that action, Eliezer the son of Aaron, Numbers 19:4, i.e. this sprinkling is performed by the deputy high priest, right? Eliezer served as his father, who was the high priest, Aaron, the first high priest. Eliezer served as his deputy high priest. So this sprinkling is performed by the deputy high priest. If even other priests cannot perform it, certainly women cannot. So the sprinkling must not be referring to the ashes of the red heifer. If this is referring to the sprinkling performed inside the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest enters there on Yom Kippur, as we know, the anointed priest in Leviticus 4:16 is written with regard to that ritual, and consequently there is no question that women are not eligible to perform that sprinkling. So rather it is referring to sprinkling the blood of a bird offering. So the Gemara explains that this is derived, and that this is only done by men. And this is derived from a kal v'chomer inference from a sheep offering. if with regard to a sheep offering concerning which the Torah did not establish a priest for its slaughter, since it may be slaughtered by anybody, the Torah nevertheless established a priest for its sprinkling, as the verse states, and the sons of Aaron, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood on the altar. Is it not logical that with regard to a burnt offering, concerning which the Torah established a priest for its pinching, which is its slaughter, an act parallel to slaughtering a sheep, so the Torah likewise established a priest for its sprinkling. And this proves that the sprinkling of the blood of a burnt offering can be performed only by priests and not by women. Right? In other words, that's how a kal v'chomer works. If, in the case of a sheep, which may be slaughtered by a non-priest, and nevertheless its sprinkling must be done by a priest, then in the case of a burnt offering, where the Torah established that even its slaughter must be done by a priest, all the more so its sprinkling must be done by a priest. That's a very typical type of kal v'chomer derivation by the sages. Now, the Mishnah teaches that these mitzvahs, these commandments that we talked about, the placing of hands, waving, bringing near, removal of a handful, burning, etc., that these mitzvahs apply specifically to men, but not to women, except for the meal offering of a sota, the suspected adulteress, and a Nazirite woman, a naziress, which these women do their own waving. So Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yoshia of his generation, i.e. the Amora, who was his contemporary, not the Tana with the same name who lived earlier, right? A Tana is a rabbi, a sage of the Mishna period, and an Amora is a rabbi, a sage of the Gemara period. So Rabbi Eliezer said to the Rabbi Yoshia of his generation, do not sit down until you explain this statement to me. From where is it derived that the meal offering of a sota requires waving? And the Gemara expresses surprise. What is the meaning of the question, from where do we derive it? It is written in the chapter dealing with the sota itself in the Torah. Numbers 5:25, quote, and he shall wave the meal offering. Rather, the question is as follows: from where do we derive that the waving is performed by the owners, right? Meaning the woman who brings the meal offering. Perhaps only the priest waves it, like the other rituals that are done in the temple that only priests can do. So Rabbi Yoshia responded, this law is derived through the verbal analogy of the term hand, stated with regard to a sota, from the term hand, stated with regard to a peace offering. And it is written here with regard to the meal offering of a sota, Numbers 5:25, and the priest shall take the meal offering of jealousy from the woman's hand, and he shall wave the meal offering. Sounds like the priest waves it. From where do we get that she waves it? And it is written there with regard to the peace offering, his own hands shall bring the offerings of the Lord made by fire. The fat with the breast shall he bring, that the breast may be waved before the Lord. Leviticus 7:30. Just as here, with regard to a sota, a priest performs the waving, so too there, with regard to a peace offering, a priest performs the waving. And just as there, with regard to a peace offering, the owner performs the waving, as indicated by the verse, so too here, with regard to a sota, the owner performs the waving. What? You just said the priest performs the waving in both instances, and you just said that the owner of the offering, the owner of the peace offering, or the owner of the meal offering of the sota performs the waving. So who performs the waving? How can both the priest and the owner perform the waving? Answer: the owner places his hands beneath the peace offering, and the priest places his hand under the hand of the owner and waves it together with him. So the Gemara asked, we found a source for the meal offering of a sota. From where do we derive that a naziress, a Nazirite woman, also waves her meal offering? And the Gemara answers, it is derived through a verbal analogy of the term palm, stated with regard to naziress, from the term palm, stated with regard to a sota. The verse concerning naziress states, and he shall place them upon the palms of the nazir. And the verse stated concerning a sota states, and he shall place it on her palms. Numbers 5:18. So just as the sota waves her meal offering together with the priest, they do it together, so too a naziress waves her offering. If a woman takes a vow of naziress, to abstain from all products of the grapevine, not to become impure for the dead, not to cut hair for a period of time. Then when the period of time ends and she has fulfilled all her obligations, she has to bring a series of offerings. Just like the male nazir, this includes waving, and she does that waving just like a male nazir would do. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 9. Here's Mishnah number 10. Any mitzvah that is dependent on the land, Eretz, applies only in Eretz Yisroel. And any mitzvah that is not dependent on the land applies both in Eretz Yisroel, the land of Israel, and outside of Eretz Yisroel. And this is apart from the mitzvahs of Orla. And this is apart from the mitzvahs of... Wait a minute. Any mitzvah that is dependent on the land applies only in the land of Israel, and any mitzvah that is not dependent on the land applies both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. And this is apart from the mitzvahs of Orla and diverse kinds. Orla is that you can't eat the fruit of a fruit tree in its first 3 years of growth. Starting the 4th year, you can start to eat it. And diverse kinds, kilayim, this refers to that you can't plant, for example, vegetables or wheat right inside a vineyard. You have to grow these things separately. You don't plant diverse kinds together. So this is apart from the mitzvahs of Orla and diverse kinds, which apply even outside of the land of Israel, even though these are, planting laws that have to do with the land. We just said that the laws that are dependent on the land only apply in the land of Israel. Laws that have nothing to do with the land apply equally outside of Israel as inside Israel. But these laws, Orla and diverse kinds, which are certainly connected to the land, apply even outside of Israel. And Rabbi Eliezer says this is the law even with regard to the prohibition to eat from the new crop before the Omer offering has been brought on the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Passover. We bring the Omer offering, and until then we cannot eat from that year's new crop. So says Rabbi Eliezer, that law also applies outside of Israel, even though it's land dependent, but he seems to be in the minority about that. We are on page 37a, and now we start the Gemara on this Mishnah number 10. And the Gemara asks, right, and see, we're drawing distinctions. So once again, we've left the distinctions between man and woman that we might expect to find in Tractate Kiddushin, and now we're back into drawing distinctions between laws that apply inside the land of Israel and laws that apply outside the land of Israel. And so what this has in common with the previous chapters is drawing these kinds of distinctions. So much of what we learn in the Talmud is drawing distinctions. It seems like so often modern society wants to erase distinctions in the name of not having, some groups be elevated over other groups. Right? And so because people are so afraid that they will privilege one group of people over another group of people, we just pretend that everyone is the same. The Torah is completely not like that. The Torah is constantly drawing distinctions between one thing and another. And if we think about, what did God do when God created the world? Well, God created many, infinitely, it's not an infinite number, but so many that we can't count, different kinds of plants, of animals, of kingdoms that are neither plant nor animal, of planets, of stars. I mean, just so many things, and they're all different from each other. And there are different laws that apply and different names that apply, etc. And so the sages are constantly being very careful to draw distinctions, right? Distinctions. So the Gemara, The Gemara asks, what is meant by mitzvahs, commandments that are dependent on the land, and what is meant by mitzvahs that are not dependent on the land? If we say that a mitzvah is called dependent in a case where it is written in a verse with regard to it coming to Eretz Yisroel, so I'm not going to keep translating that as the land of Israel. Just get used to the term. Eretz Yisroel means the land of Israel, as opposed to Yisrael, Israel, which really refers to the children of Israel. We, the people, the Jews, the descendants of Jacob, who was also called Israel. So Eretz Yisroel is the land of Israel, as opposed to Israel, which is the people. Okay, what is meant by mitzvahs that are dependent on the land, and what is meant by mitzvahs that are not dependent on the land? If we say that a mitzvah is called dependent in a case where it is written in a verse with regard to it coming to Eretz Yisroel, and a mitzvah that is not dependent on the land is one concerning which the verb coming or the verb bringing is not written in a verse with regard to it, that would lead to a difficulty. Right? The Torah was given before the children of Israel had entered the land of Israel, right? We were wandering in the wilderness. It ended up being a 40-year wandering in the Midbar, in the wilderness, before we actually entered the land. So during that period, when the Torah had already been given, right, there needed to be distinction for the people to understand that certain laws aren't going to apply until Joshua, ends up being Joshua, leads us into the land of Israel. So some of these laws are preceded by, when you come to the land of Israel, you shall do such and such. So they're saying, is that how we know whether a law is actually dependent on the land of Israel or not? Because there are going to be Jewish farmers who end up not living in Israel, certainly, later, once the diaspora began. So do those farmers, are they obligated in the same laws that farmers in Eretz Yisroel are obligated in? How do we know whether they are or they're not? So the first thing the Gemara examines is, what about maybe the distinction is laws that are introduced in the Torah with the verb come, like when you come to the land or when you bring to the land, right? So maybe it's the coming or bringing. But that immediately leads to a difficulty. But aren't there the mitzvahs of donning tefillin and the redemption of the firstborn donkey, in which the verse states bringing in the passage, it shall be when the Lord shall bring you to the land of the Canaanite, and every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, and it shall be for a sign upon your hand and a symbol before your eyes. That's tefillin. And yet, those mitzvahs certainly apply both in Eretz Yisroel and outside of Eretz Yisroel. So we can't depend on whether a particular law is introduced with this verbiage of when you come to the land or when the Lord brings you to the land. So Rav Yehuda said that this is what the Mishna is saying. Any mitzvah that is an obligation of the body, i.e. an obligation upon the person, right, a human with a human body, applies both in Eretz Yisroel and outside of Eretz Yisroel. Conversely, an obligation of the land, that is, a mitzvah that applies specifically to the earth and its growths, applies only in Eretz Yisroel. So the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? And the Gemara answers, this is as the sages taught in a Baraisa. The verse states, these are the statutes and ordinances that you shall observe to do in the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess it all the days that you live upon the earth. Now, when we speak in English, right, you have to do you have to translate it one way or another for us to be learning in English. And so it says statutes and ordinances. But you should know that there's a difference between chukim and mishpatim, which is what we're usually talking about. Statutes in the Koran is the translation of chukim, right? And a huk, this is a law, and it usually refers to the kind of a law that makes no sense, right? Like you can't eat milk and meat together. Like there's no logical reason for that. We do that because God said so. right? We do that because God said so. There's a lot of laws like that. Chukim, that shooing away the mother bird when you collect the chicks, not really explained. The law of the red heifer is the classic chok. Why is it that to be purified from coming into contact with a corpse, you need to be sprinkled with waters that contain the ashes of a red heifer? Because God said so. Not any logical derivation. Whereas the mishpatim, ordinances, right? So this refers to laws that make some kind of logical sense. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kidnap. Who could run a society if those things were permitted? So logically, they make a lot more sense. Okay. So this is the sages taught. So we're referring to a baraisa that's going to help us understand the difference between laws that are incumbent on the body versus laws that are incumbent on the land. And it would seem that laws incumbent on the body apply to Jews everywhere. Laws incumbent on the land apply to Jews residing in Eretz Yisroel. So going back, Deuteronomy 12:1. These are the statutes, chukim, and the ordinances, mishpatim, that you shall observe to do in the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess it all the days that you live upon the earth. It sounds like in the land, right? And the verse is interpreted as follows. The phrase, these are the statutes, ela hachukim, these are the statutes, means that these are the expositions, Elu hamidrashot, right? Expositions, sort of expositions of the chukim that the sages learn from verses. And with regard to the phrase, these are the ordinances, vehamishpatim, these are monetary laws. Another area that has a lot of logic to it. And with regard to that you shall observe, this is referring to the study of matters that must be observed for one to perform them. And as for the phrase to do, these are the laws that you shall do, this is referring to action, the actual performance of a mitzvah, right? So the chukim sort of require midrashot, right? That we really delve into them. We can maybe never understand exactly why God gave us these laws, but they're sort of pregnant with possibility, and the sages dive into them and come up with all kinds of revolutionary ideas. And then the ordinances, right, the mishpatim, here it's being applied to monetary laws, right? And you have to figure out exactly, right? That's what the Talmud does. Where we're headed, our next tractate spends so much attention on, okay, if damages need to be awarded, if contracts need to be settled in court, exactly how are we going to do that? That you shall observe. This is referring to study of the matters that must be performed for one to perform. In other words, laws that we don't even understand how to follow them until the sages study it for us and tell us how to do it. And to do means, we're all obligated to do it. So the baraisa continues. Now, from the phrase in the land, ba'aretz, right, in the land, one might have thought that all mitzvahs apply only in Eretz Yisroel. Right? You might have thought that all of the laws of the Torah are only incumbent on Jews who are dwelling in the land of Israel. And if Jews are not in the land of Israel, then they're not obligated in these laws. You might have thought that, since living in the land of Israel is so central to everything that the Torah talks about. Remember, it was given to the Jewish people who had left Egypt en masse and were going to enter Israel to live there en masse. So you might have thought that all these laws apply only in Israel. All of the laws apply only in Israel. You might have thought that. So how is it determined which... wait a minute, where am I? From the phrase ba'aretz, one might have thought that all mitzvahs apply only in Eretz Yisroel. Therefore, the verse also states, all the days that you live upon the earth, i.e. wherever you live. Furthermore, if the merciful one had written only the phrase all the days, one might have thought that all mitzvahs should apply both in Eretz Yisroel and outside of Eretz Yisroel. So now you might have thought, well, all these laws apply everywhere, whether you live in Israel or not. Therefore, the verse also states in the land. And between these two ideas, we derive that some of the laws apply only in Eretz Yisroel, and others of the law apply both in Eretz Yisroel and outside of Eretz Yisroel. And the baraisa continues. Once the verse includes areas outside of Eretz Yisroel and also excludes areas outside of Eretz Yisroel, how is it determined which mitzvahs apply outside the land and which do not? And the Baraisa answers, go and learn from what is stated with regard to a different issue that appears in the next verse. You shall destroy all the places where the nations that you are to dispossess, right, meaning the Canaanite nations when you enter the promised land, you are to destroy all the places where those nations that you are to dispossess served their gods. You are to destroy all the altars of idolatry. That's what is being said. This is Deuteronomy 12:2. And just as the prohibition of idol worship is distinct in that it is an obligation of the body, and it applies both in Eretz Yisroel and outside of Eretz Yisroel, so too, any mitzvah that is an obligation of the body applies both in Eretz Yisroel and outside of Eretz Yisroel. Conversely, mitzvahs that are an obligation connected to the land apply only in Eretz Yisroel. This derivation is slightly problematic. Why? Because with regard to destroying the places where other nations conduct idol worship, it is a mitzvah to obliterate idolatry from Eretz Yisroel. But there is no obligation to seek and destroy it outside of Eretz Yisroel. Nevertheless, any idolatry found in a place conquered by Jews should be destroyed as well. Now, if you happen to have this situation, you might want to consult with a rabbi about it. But basically, even if you live outside of Israel, if you purchase property, right, now it's your property, and you find in that property that the previous residents had some kind of altar of idolatry, right, bowing to statues, that they did that there, so you should remove all of that. You must remove all of that from your property. If you're a Jew, you cannot have any kind of altar of idolatry in your property. There's a lot of other nuances to this law, but that is not really what we're talking about now. Now, the Mishna teaches that all mitzvahs that are dependent on the land apply only in Eretz Yisroel, apart from Orla, can't use the first 3 years of a fruit tree, and the prohibition of diverse kinds. You can't plant wheat in a vineyard. Rabbi Eliezer says this is the law even with regard to the prohibition to eat from the new crop. You can't eat from that year's new crop until the omer is brought on the second day of Passover. A dilemma was raised before them. Does Rabbi Eliezer disagree with the first Tana with the intent to rule more leniently? Or does he disagree with the Tana with the intent to rule more stringently? Is he saying that, okay, Orla and Kilayim, diverse kinds, I agree with you that they apply outside the land of Israel as well, and I add to that list that you can't eat from the new crop until the omer is brought on the second day of Passover? Or is he saying, no, I disagree with you, those other, Orla and Kilayim don't apply outside of Israel. The only one that applies outside of Israel is the omer, is not eating the new crop until the omer. Which one is he saying? So the Gemara elaborates, it is possible that Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with the first Tana with the intent to rule more stringently, and this is what the first Tana is saying. All mitzvahs that are dependent on the land apply only in Eretz Yisroel, apart from Orla and diverse kinds, as we learned this law through a tradition transmitted to Moses from Sinai. How do we know that Orla and Kilayim apply even outside of Eretz Yisroel? Because God told Moses that at Mount Sinai, and that's a tradition that goes all the way back to there, one of the original laws of the oral law that was transmitted at Sinai. Although one could say that each of them, Orla and Kilayim, is an obligation of the land and should apply only in Eretz Yisroel. Nevertheless, they are obligatory outside of Eretz Yisroel as well, because God told that to Moses. But the prohibition of the new crop, which is an obligation of the land, yes, it applies in Eretz Yisroel, but outside of Eretz Yisroel, no, it does not apply. Oh, so Rabbi Eliezer might be saying, not that we're going to add to that list, but that we're not going to add to that list. And what is the reason of the first Tana? Oh, I'm sorry, no. That would be the view of the Tana of this Baraisa that we're bringing. Our Mishnah, right? This interpretation is saying, okay, what we thought, right? The Tana, the rabbi who composed our Mishnah, is saying The laws dependent on the land apply only in Eretz Yisrael, except Orla and Kilayim. Those apply outside of Israel. And eating the first crop is included in the first group. It doesn't apply outside of Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Eliezer is going to disagree. Now, what is the reason of this Tana of our Mishnah? In the verse, it states, with regard to the new crop, in all your dwellings, Leviticus 23:14, the term dwelling does not mean that this law applies wherever Jews live. Rather, it means that the mitzvah is applicable only in Eretz Yisrael, as this phrase indicates a time after inheritance and settlement of Eretz Yisrael by the Jewish people, led by Joshua into the land of Canaan, taking it over, turning it into the land of Israel. When they are actually dwelling in the land and not when they are in the process of conquering it. This is the opinion of the first Tana. So that law of not eating from the first crop would only apply once the Jews finished conquering the land in the time of Joshua. And Rabbi Eliezer comes to say, even the prohibition with regard to the new crop applies both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. And what is the reason for Rabbi Eliezer? He explains that the term dwelling means wherever you dwell. This is one possible way to understand the dispute between the Tana and Rabbi Eliezer, according to which the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer is more stringent than that of the first Tana. Or perhaps Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with the Tana of the Mishnah in order to rule more leniently. And this is what the first Tana was saying. All mitzvahs that are dependent on the land apply only in Eretz Yisrael, apart from Orla and diverse kinds, as we learn this law through tradition, and all the more so apart from the new crop, which applies outside of Eretz Yisrael, as the term dwelling indicates wherever you dwell. This is the opinion of the first Tana, according to this interpretation. And Rabbi Eliezer comes to say the prohibition of the new crop applies only in Eretz Yisrael, as the term dwelling indicates a time after inheritance and settlement of Eretz Yisrael by the Jewish people. So the Gemara asks, and accordingly, what is the meaning of the word even, with which Rabbi Eliezer begins his statement? It is not referring to Orla or diverse kinds, which apply outside of Eretz Yisrael. God told that to Moses at Sinai. But to the first clause, which states that a mitzvah that is dependent on the land applies only in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Eliezer adds that this principle includes the new crop as well. Having presented the two ways in which one can explain the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, the Gemara attempts to prove which is correct and suggests, come in here a proof from that which Abaye said. Who is the Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer? It is Rabbi Ishmael, as it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to the mitzvah of bringing libations with offerings, right? That we bring either a wine or a water libation with offerings. This serves to teach you that wherever the term dwelling is stated, the mitzvah in question applies only after the inheritance and settlement of Eretz Yisrael. This is the statement of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Akiva said to him, but there is the case of Shabbos, in which it is stated it is a Shabbos to the land in all your dwellings. Leviticus 23:3. And this mitzvah applies both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbi Ishmael said to Rabbi Akiva, Shabbos is derived through the following kal v'chomer inference. If less stringent mitzvahs apply both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael, is it not all the more so reasonable that Shabbos, which is a very stringent mitzvah, should apply everywhere? And the Gemara explains the proof from the fact that Abaye said, who is the Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer? It is Rabbi Ishmael. And Rabbi Ishmael says that the term dwelling means that the mitzvah applies after Eretz Yisrael has been entirely settled. One can conclude from it that Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with the first Tana with the intent to rule more stringently, as he evidently maintains that the term dwelling means wherever Jews are located. And the Gemara affirms, conclude from that Baraisa that this is so. So the Gemara asks an incidental question with regard to Rabbi Ishmael's opinion now that we've brought it up. Now, where does Rabbi Ishmael stand, i.e. to which specific mitzvah is he referring? he is referring to the obligation to bring libations, from which he learns that all mitzvahs that feature the term dwelling apply only after Eretz Yisroel had been conquered and settled. With regard to libations, and now we're on page 37b, which is shorter than 37a, both the term coming, when you come to the land, and the term dwelling, when you dwell in the land, are written, meaning when you come into the land of your dwellings, Numbers 15:2. How then can Rabbi Ishmael cite this example to teach about cases where only the term dwelling is written? And the Gemara answers that this is what the Bryce is saying. This teaches that wherever both coming and dwelling are stated, it applies only after inheritance and settlement of Eretz Yisroel. This is the statement of Rabbi Ishmael. So the Gemara asks, if so, consider that Rabbi Akiva said to him, but there is the verse stated with regard to Shabbos, Leviticus 23:3, in which it is stated dwellings. And Rabbi Ishmael said to him, Shabbos is derived through a kal v'chomer inference, but let Rabbi Ishmael say to Rabbi Akiva instead, I say my principle only when coming and dwelling are both written. And in the case of Shabbos, the verse states only the term dwelling. And so the Gemara answers, Rabbi Ishmael states one reason and then he adds another reason. One reason is that I say my principle only when coming and dwelling are written together. And the other reason, with regard to that which you say, that there is the case of Shabbos, in which it is stated only dwellings, well, Shabbos is also derived through the kal v'chomer inference. So the Gemara asks, with regard to what do Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva actually disagree? And the Gemara answers, they disagree with regard to whether Jews sacrificed libations when they were still in the wilderness before entering the land. Rabbi Ishmael maintains they did not sacrifice libations in the wilderness, as the obligation to sacrifice libations came into effect only once they were living in Eretz Yisroel. And Rabbi Akiva maintains they did sacrifice libations in the wilderness. Rabbi Akiva derives a different law from the term dwelling. Abaye said this statement of the Tana of the school of Rabbi Ishmael, that only when the terms coming and dwelling are both written does the mitzvah take effect after settling Eretz Yisroel, diverges from another statement of the Tana of the school of Rabbi Ishmael. Right? Abaye says, wait a minute, let's make sure we understand what Rabbi Ishmael and his students were saying, because they even seem to contradict themselves. And this is as the Tana of the school of Rabbi Ishmael taught, since instances of coming to Eretz Yisroel are mentioned in the Torah in connection to several mitzvahs, without specifying precisely when the Jewish people are considered to have arrived there, and the verse specified in one of its references that it applies only after inheritance and settlement of Eretz Yisroel, in the mitzvah of appointing a king. Appointing a king, right? It's the Torah talks about when you appoint a king. Now that didn't happen for hundreds of years after the people had already been dwelling in the land of Israel. Think about it, right? America was basically created 1776, and that was confirmed when we won the American Revolution against England, which I think didn't end till like 1789. And so how long ago was that? 250 years, more or less. So the children of Israel came into the land of Israel under Joshua, and then were ruled by judges, right? Kind of the leaders of the generation, and occasionally who would become a military leader when necessary, for 400 years. 400 years. Before the prophet Samuel comes along, and by demand of the people, anoints a king over them. King Saul, right? And then eventually Saul gets deposed, and then we have King David and King Solomon, and it's Solomon who builds the temple, right? But 400 years, the people did not seemingly perform this mitzvah of appointing a king over themselves. And by the way, when they do have a king anointed and appointed over them, God doesn't like it, and the prophet Samuel does not like it. Why? Because our king is God. The only reason we end up demanding a king is because everybody else has a king, so we want a king too, right? So interesting, God basically God knows everything. God saw that in the future the people would just, couldn't live without a king. And so they would have a king, but the king would be appointed by Torah law. So this law in the Torah was sort of like, well, you shouldn't have a king, but if you must have a king, then this is the manner of appointing the king and have the laws that he should follow. So now let's continue reading. Where am I? Okay, here we go. So let's just read this paragraph again. So this is Abaye is pointing out that in the school of Rabbi Ishmael, they seem to have a contradiction about when do these certain mitzvahs apply. The mitzvahs that apply only in the land of Israel, when do they start to apply? Is it when you finish conquering the land, or is it even before you finish conquering the land? So this is as the Tana of the school of Rabbi Ishmael taught, since instances of coming to Eretz Yisroel are mentioned in the Torah in connection to several mitzvahs without specifying precisely when the Jewish people are considered to have arrived there, and the verse specified in one of its references that it applies only after inheritance and settlement of Eretz Yisroel, in the mitzvah of appointing a king. Deuteronomy 17:14. When you come to the land and you inherit it and settle it, and then it goes on to talk about appointing a king. So too, wherever coming to the land is mentioned without qualification, it means after inheritance and settlement. So according to this opinion of the school of Rabbi Ishmael, there is no need for the verse to also mention the term dwelling. But there's this other statement from the school of Rabbi Ishmael, and the other Tana of the school of Rabbi Ishmael, cited in the dispute with Rabbi Akiva, would say that this is no proof, because there is not only the case of a king, but also the mitzvah of first fruits, bikurim, where the verse also uses the terms of coming to the land, inheriting it, and dwelling in it. Consequently, these are two verses that come as one, i.e. to teach the same matter, and any two verses that come as one do not teach a precedent that applies to other cases. And the other Tana, i.e. the Tana of the school of Rabbi Ishmael cited by Abaye, would answer, well, both of these cases are necessary, as one cannot be derived from the other. As if the merciful one had written the matter only with regard to a king, and had not written in it concerning the first fruits, I would say this delay of when these laws start to apply applies only to the mitzvah of appointing a king. Whereas with regard to the mitzvah of first fruits, since one benefits from eating fruit, he should have to bring it immediately and not wait until the land has been inherited and settled after the conquest in the time of Joshua. And conversely, had the merciful one written this matter only with regard to first fruits and had not written in the case of a king, I would say that as it is the manner of a king to conquer, one must be appointed immediately, even before entering the land of Israel. If we're going to have kings, right, maybe we should appoint our king before we get into the business of conquering the Canaanite nations, because the king will lead the troops. And the Tana of the school of Rabbi Ishmael, cited in the dispute with Rabbi Akiva. I'm almost done, by the way. Please get your comments and questions in right now. And the Tana of the school of Rabbi Ishmael, cited in the dispute with Rabbi Akiva, would respond, let the merciful one write this with regard to a king, and it would not be required to write in the case of first fruits, as I would say. And if a king, whose task is to conquer Eretz Yisroel, nevertheless is appointed only after inheritance and settlement of the land, then with regard to first fruits, is it not all the more so reasonable that a similar law apply to them? If so, these are two verses that come as one, which do not teach a precedent we extend to other cases. And the other, i.e. the Tana of the school of Rabbi Ishmael, cited by Abaye, would say, if the merciful one had written this only with regard to a king, I would say that the Jews should be obligated in the mitzvah of first fruits immediately upon entering Eretz Yisroel, and I would not derive the law of first fruits from that of appointing a king, just as it is with regard to the separation of challah, another priestly gift from one's produce, which applied immediately upon the entrance to Eretz Yisroel and did not wait for the conquest to be complete. Therefore, the verse is necessary as it teaches us that this is not so. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Looks like I've got 2 questions. Aoife says, my mother told me that there was evidence that milk made it more difficult for the human body to digest meat. I get it, however, that the reason we keep the laws is just because God tells us to. Right, I mean, we've mentioned this before. Very often you'll hear people say, well, the reason that the Torah forbade the Jews in ancient times to eat pork is because pork was very dangerous and it was really a health concern. And the answer to that is no. That is not why the law was given. The law still applies when pork is just as healthy as beef. And the answer is, as we learned elsewhere in the Talmud, if asked, why is it that you Jews don't eat pork? The right answer is, I gotta tell you, pork looks great. It smells great. I bet it tastes great. But what can I do? My Father in heaven said I'm not permitted to eat it, so I can't eat it. That's in that class of chukim. Aoife says there might be, some underlying logical reason for milk and meat not being eaten together, but nevertheless, the basic understanding is we just do it because God said so. Now, Rambam, Maimonides, was definitely in your camp, Aoife, maybe the greatest Jewish commentator of all time. I mean, certainly in the company of Rashi and Moses and Akiva, for example. But Rambam, Maimonides, would always look for these underlying logical reasons, even in chukim, and trying to understand them. Also, King Solomon tried to understand them. And it was he who said, I believe I found a reason for everything, but the law of the red heifer, I just can't understand. I can't find a logical reason for that. But Rambam would look for the reasons, and he would say that just because we can't figure it out and just because we can't know for sure shouldn't stop us from asking and suggesting what these reasons might be. We just has to be humble and at the end of the day say these are guesses and we can't know for sure. Tom, interesting. Sounds like the Torah is saying that so many laws that apply only to the Israelites when living in the land were given to Moses and the Israelites long before any of them would ever be living in the land, correct? So they are studying laws that they cannot fulfill while they are in the desert. Yes. Just like we too are studying laws we may not be able to fulfill because, for example, the temple is not standing. Yes, exactly, just so, right? I mean, you would think that some of these laws which seem to be dependent on living in Eretz Yisroel, well, now Jews have sovereignty in the land of Israel. We have the modern state of Israel. There are still certain laws that we don't do. Why haven't we brought them back? Answer, because we don't have the temple, right? And this is where you'll find sometimes it seems like incomprehensible that you have certain extremely pious groups who seem to be anti-Zionist, right? Even though they have members of these groups that live in the land of Israel, they're against the sovereignty in the land of Israel of the modern state of Israel. Why would they feel that way? I am not in that group. But why would this group have that feeling? It's not that they're crazy. It's that they're saying that sovereignty of the Jews over the land of Israel doesn't just mean that there's a secular government that is, run by Jews. Sovereignty of the land of Israel means that we are dwelling in the land of Israel under God as our king, possibly with a human king sitting on a throne, but where the law of the land is the Torah and not any other body of law. And that is not the case. And in the absence of the Holy Temple, which will only be returned according to our tradition when the Messiah comes, when Mashiach comes, and the third temple won't be built by the hands of man. It will essentially drop down from heaven, built by the hand of God. Until then, thank God we're free according to these groups that I'm talking about. Until then, thank God Jews are free to live in the land of Israel and, walk around in the land of Israel, pray in the land of Israel, but it's not the same as actual sovereignty over the land of Israel, right? Now, even for, religious Zionists, right, who are, might have disagreements with the government, all people do. It's the most Israeli thing to disagree with the government. But nevertheless, they consider that this state of Israel that we have now is the dawning, shall we say, of the Messianic age. It hasn't arrived yet, but we are now in a different state of being than we were in for the last 2,000 years when there was no state of Israel. And even though there are many laws of the kinds that we're discussing today that don't quite apply yet, right? There is no temple, we can't bring offerings, and that sort of trickles out to other laws that aren't necessarily part of bringing offerings to the temple itself, and nevertheless we don't practice them, right? So we don't practice teruma, we don't practice giving a tithe to the Levite. So even though that wouldn't be brought to the temple, theoretically we could be doing that now. That doesn't apply yet until the temple is restored. So there's a lot of nuance to these areas, but what we were talking about today is this distinction between laws that apply in Israel and laws that apply outside of Israel, and why. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, at the regular time of 6 p.m.